Yeah, so first of all, just wanted to say thank you for, I think it's great that we met in the way that we met. And
Unbelievable.
yeah,
Unbelievable. Yeah.
uh, and I'm so glad that we're gonna get a chance to do this dialogue. I told you on the street when I ran into you that I'm a huge fan, and I came and saw your work at Berkeley Rep over and over and over again, specifically the Meisner, like I think 6 times in
Yeah.
6 weeks or something like that. And I saw you in Figaro, I think Marriage of Figaro and Treasure Island,
Oh, yeah. Wow.
uh, and Tartuffe. I think you also did there, right?
Big Tartuffe there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that was the reboot that went to South Coast Rep and to the
Right.
Shakespeare Theater in DC and then to Berkeley.
So, I said to you on the street, which is absolutely true, and I'll tell anybody. When somebody asks me like who my favorite theater actors are, there's like who top three, and it's Stephen Epp, and that performance in the Meisner in particular, like what you were doing with your voice, what you were doing with your body, as an actor recently out of training and still sort of finding my way. I just remember feeling just blown away with how you were using your instrument and inspired by that. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. It's always
At
nice
the
to,
risk.
it's
What's
always
that?
it's always such a lovely thing when you encounter someone who is like affected by what you do because you always hope that's what's happening, but and that people, the audience is like, they're laughing or they're very, they're crying, they're silent, they're applauding, they're booing, who knows.
Mm.
But that other level of influence and inspiration is really rewarding. So rewarding.
I've taught for years. I think you teach as well, right?
Actually, no, I mean, I have a little bit.
Yeah.
I am I have some very dear friends who are phenomenal teachers, and I have never been comfortable teaching.
Interesting. Well, what I was going to say about that was it took me years, but I realized, when you're doing what you're doing, whether it's a kind of transmission or just the proximity with other artists, there's a kind of teaching going on, even if
Yeah,
it's not directly in a classroom, and
that's what I've always, when people have said, well, why don't you teach? You have to teach. You should be teaching. And I'm like, well, I'm not, I just don't know how to, and I don't feel comfortable. And I've never found my way there. But I know that I'm, I have a lot to offer in the rehearsal room to younger actors and to the people I'm on stage with, that I have influenced and taught people by doing it together, or
right.
watching my go at it and then my being able to offer some, coaching or advice or, just observations. But it's all, I'm most comfortable all of that comes from the actual doing of the work.
Which I think might be
Toward
the highest.
toward performance and in performance. I'm not as good at it, like, for like feel like a philosoph. I love the philosophy of it. I can talk about acting forever, but I really, to me, ultimately, it has to be in front. It's the proof of how it gets from your body and your ideas and the text and the whatever that you're working from. But until it's in front of the audience, it doesn't, in a certain sense, mean anything.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. If you can't go from theory to practice, it doesn't count for much.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just gonna, for anybody who might be watching or listening that don't know your work, I'm just gonna read a little here from your bio on the Moving Company website.
I'm sure.
So today we got Stephen Epp, writer and co-artistic director of the Moving Company and Theatre de la Jeune Lune from 1983 to 2008. Steve's acting credits include the roles in Caruso, Hamlet, Gulliver, Figaro, The Miser, many of those which I got a chance to see. Locally, he's graced the stage at Guthrie, 10,000 Things, The Jungle. His work also brought him to La Jolla Playhouse, Berkeley Rep, where I saw you, Spoleto Festival, American Repertory Theater, Actors Theater of Louisville, Alley Theater, Seattle Rep, Theater for a New Audience, the New Victory Theater off Broadway, many others. And in addition to creating new work for the Moving Company, you have authored plays, including Children of Paradise, which was awarded the 1993 Outer Critics Circle Award. You've been a Fox Fellow in 1999, a 2009 McKnight Playwrights Center Fellow, 2013, I don't know how to say that, Beneke Fellow?
Beinecke. Yeah.
Beinecke Fellow at Yale University, and a 2012 Helen Hayes Award for Best Actor. It's quite a list. So again, thank you for being here. I think, my interest in conversation is in, the name of my website right now is Evolving Actor. So part of what's interesting to me is not just the higher reaches of the craft and the spiritual dimensions of it, of the work possibly,
Yeah.
but also just the where we're headed, possibly what's unfolding in this universe that we work in and live in these days. So but when I interview people, it's always nice to go back to find out a little bit about, I don't know, your origin story, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if there was, like, how early did you start, and what was it that was the origin story?
Well, I mean, it's funny because this show that I'm doing right now here, this that we've been premiering with my daughter, that's based on Orlando, but we've very much infused ourselves into it because my daughter grew up around Theater de la Jeune Lune. So there's an aspect to the show which you'll see tomorrow. It's partly about, you know, the influence of a child growing up in a theater and how that influenced her to become an actor and her relationship to me. And for me, I grew up, and this is talked about in the show, which I've never done before. I grew up in South Dakota in a tiny, tiny town. It was actually a Mennonite town, not Amish, but we're like Amish adjacent. So it was a very, it was a town of 1,100 people. And it's in the flattest part of South Dakota. And um, as a kid, from as very early on, I wanted to be an actor. And I don't really know where that came from, but that's what I wanted to do. I somehow knew that earlier than I knew just about anything. And the only influences I had really was the bit of television that I would see. And so it was things like watching I Love Lucy and watching Lucille Ball, or watching, some of the old, I didn't really see Sid Caesar. I'm not that old, but um, like Red Skelton, like those early shows that have their roots really in theater and vaudeville and that sort of live performance. But you can kind of see it, the Jackie, the Honeymooners, all that. And that's really what I had to like grab onto. um, and that's what I wanted to do. Like I sort of wanted to be Lucille Ball, just goofing around with Ethel and doing crazy, stuff. And then, of course, you begin to have some influences. And they would occasionally put on maybe once a year a local pageant or play or something. And my mom, or an operetta, and my mom was in those sometimes. So I saw my mom on stage, and these are like super simple community type productions.
Sure.
But there was something about seeing it live and seeing those people there, even in this rudimentary, school gymnasium stage, that I wanted that. I wanted to be doing that. Then I was fortunate to have a very instructor in high school who actually had studied theater, and she came to our school, and so she sort of knew a little bit more, like, you can do this. You can actually go be a professional actor. So then I went to Gustavus Adolphus College, which is a very small college in Minnesota, near Minneapolis. And it had a fantastic faculty. And that's what made all the difference. They were from all over, and they were very different approaches. One was an Australian guy who had a very British approach. And another one was this guy from Colombia. I mean, he was American, but he had lived for years in Bogota, Colombia. and he was very Grotowski based, very, you know, physical. And then another guy who was sort of more straight up American method, who had studied at Berkeley and at Oberlin. And so the department, it was like being part of a company. And we did a really wide range of work for a little, you know, small liberal arts college. And that's where I began to feel like, oh, this is what it's like to be a professional actor. And
That's a pretty good combo with the three
yeah.
different types of teachers.
And yes, that's what was so fantastic about it, you know, because you really got pushed in a lot of different directions, which I think is actually really healthy. And I was coming from such a small, like, to go to New York was just beyond my sort of capacity to take on. But Minneapolis is a very, very dynamic theater town. And especially at that time, there was a lot of small companies, people doing new work of all sorts, and then some, you know, more straight up, you know, the classic canon of, you know, a 5-show season, and, you know, so that's how I started. I always intended to get an MFA or something, and then never did, because very quickly I saw the work of Jeune, which had begun to work in Minneapolis and Paris. They were back and forth between Paris and Minneapolis. So they brought and exposed me to this, you know, European tradition of theater, especially like Peter Brook, Ariane Mouchkine, and the Théâtre Soleil, and, you know, all the great history of French 20th century theater. And
And Dominique went to the Lecoq School, right?
all the 4 founders of the company, Dominique Strand, Vincent Gracieux, Barbara Berlovitz, and Bob Rosen. So it was 2 Americans, 2 French, and they'd all been in school together, and they started the company. And that's what brought them to the U.S. was the American. Right. And then the dream was to go back and forth and be a very international company, which we did for quite a while, and then eventually stayed in Minneapolis and got our own space, which was a phenomenal, hugely renovated, gigantic warehouse. And
I remember hearing tell of it.
It's almost no other space in the country like it, really. Yeah. So once I saw their work, I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. I had some inkling that this kind of theater existed, but I'd never quite seen it like that. And I was like, then I just made sure they got to know me, and I just weaseled my way basically into the company. And then I stayed with them for 25 years. So really I had worked with a few other companies in town and done other things that were one company that was, all the work was working with playwrights. So young playwrights would come in, we'd improvise with them and work, and then they would go and write and then come back with a play, and then we'd do that. So it was very much that process of creating but in relation to writers, playwrights. And I also worked with sort of bread and puppet theater style puppet theater, and that was all mask work and huge puppetry and bunraku style puppets, and it's a whole different kind of training, really, because it's not about your internal life and all that, you know, that side of the.
And that was like concurrent with the early years of Jeune.
Yeah, everything kind of overlapped, and then I stayed with Jeune once I got in the company. They invited me in, and we did a lot of teaching in the early years. So I sort of felt like I had kind of gone to the Jacques Lecoq School. I mean, we did all training over those first few years, but it was more like boot camp because we were also performing constantly and creating the next show. It just rolled.
That was internal. Meaning he was running those exercises for the company, basically.
Well, we were it was partly a way of like funding the company.
Funding, yeah, sure, I see.
We would do extensive workshops for other actors who would come, but the company would do it also. We all took part and taught. And then it was also a way of researching the next show. We would also use the workshop to like research commedia or research clown or research Greek tragedy, or, you know. So
can I back up just a little bit to some of the.
Yeah, sorry, I have a tendency to just like ramble.
It's all right, totally fine. And I have a tendency to interject, so we'll see how that goes.
Please do, please do.
All right. I'm just kind of curious. I always think it's interesting, when there's parents as role models, and but I'm wondering if like what was the first time you were on stage? Did you get like, was there a moment that you can remember that was a strong affirmation of like, this is it, or like, now I'm doing it, and
I
like
think I
what?
well, I think I had I mean this is good. I had a couple moments as a kid, because I would make up plays and I would force everybody to watch them, or I
Oh,
would
okay.
do things in the living room suddenly, and I remember one of the first times I did some crazy, like to the Lawrence Welk show, and I would dance in the living room, and I did a whole thing, and then did a huge face plant pratfall at the end, and everybody laughed, and I was like, oh, so that's how it works.
Yeah.
But I was really little, but it's one of those where it's like it it just was different. It was like, oh, that's a manipulated, performed thing that gets a
Mm.
reaction, you know. But then with this teacher, this very influential high school teacher, we did a Pinter play. We did The Room,
Oh,
and
wow.
we really, we went in sort of deep for high school students, and it was really a profound acting, sort of that one of those first ones where it's like, oh, okay, this is what it's like to live inside a role, and really, you know, try to, perform that, but be in it completely at the same time.
God bless really great high school teachers, because I think we had a high school teacher in my school too who did, the Scottish play, and did
Yeah,
just like our town, or like stuff that felt like dramatic literature and not just,
yeah, exactly.
light.
Makes so all the difference. And she was like, okay, the football team is practicing and the basketball team is practicing, and they drill and practice and practice and practice. Theater is the same way. You can't just show up, kind of learn your lines, and do the play. Like, we have to work, we have to take it apart, we have to hone it, we have to drill it. You have to know, she came with that sort of discipline that this is serious. This is serious work.
Yeah. That actually brings up a question. I wondered, because you're obviously, your physical gifts as a performer are a big part of what makes you who you are as a performer. But were you an athlete also, or was that never a part of your path?
No, I wish I could say.
No,
I mean, we were physical. I mean, we swam, we ran, we played, we did stuff. But I was never like, I was never
never
brilliant.
played.
I was never good at baseball. I was never particularly good at basketball, any of the things. I was really little, for one thing. I was a skinny,
Oh,
scrawny little kid. Um, my family were wrestlers. My oldest brother was like a state champion wrestler, and
right.
so that's what we weren't football or basketball people. Um, and he was sort of like a mean son of a bitch. He's also a great guy, but I mean, so, and I wasn't particularly good at it. I tried.
Got it. So
I sang.
pratfalls. You
I was into music, and I was into theater, and I was into debate, and I was into speech and all that stuff.
Oh, you did some of that as well.
Oh yeah.
Um, all right. So then, I was gonna the Gustavus Adolphus. It's funny. I almost went to the Gustavus Adolphus.
Oh really? Wow.
Yeah, to play hockey. Oddly, I was gonna
Oh,
go, and
sure,
I
of
think they
course.
had a Division III ice hockey team or something that I was gonna play for. It's too cold for me. I couldn't come from California to do that.
Oh God.
Uh, but I wanted to touch in on I think the teacher who you said did some work in South America and Augusta. I'm assuming that was some like Boal style
Yeah.
political theater, or happenings and that sort of thing. And then you said when you worked with him, it was just sort of, did he, this Grotowski style stuff, did he actually work with Grotowski at some point, or how had he come across that?
He had, if I have this right, he had helped form, like, through the University of Bogota with students, a sort of student, and this is like in the late '60s, early '70s. So it's like when student groups and the protests, and I mean, he had to flee the country when Allende was assassinated, and they were very, so it was that mix of taking theater, and it's Gustav Boll's influence of, using theater, using to you know, to
Agitate
agitate.
political.
Yeah, and they had I think they had were in communication with Grotowski, and I believe he came. I think they were able to bring
Mm.
him like a workshop, but there was some connection, and he may have gone and studied with him also somewhere. But so there was some, besides just reading and understanding his work through that, there was actual encounter. Um, so,
Mm. I'm
but
curious because like what time that was or what it was it because Krotowski evolved how he was working over the years and you know I I've worked for a number of years and now I'm starting to offer because a mentor of mine who did this Krotowski work recently passed away and so I've sort of started to continue that in my own way but it's falls in this period of what's called para theater. I don't know if you have any familiar,
yeah,
which is more like the ritual theater where there's no performative context, um, but he later abandoned that for the most part and moved on to other things like the objective theater. But
which that's,
I'm
I mean,
curious.
I think that's what's so fascinating to me, and I can't say that I've followed and deeply his evolution, but the fact that he keeps these artists who keep reinventing themselves in a certain way and just keep pursuing into different territory. And I feel like Brooke did that as well. I don't know that you could say that Teatro Soleil did as, evolved as much, although they did. Um, and that was something I just feel like that's so important. That's so inevitable as an artist and as an actor that you have to let it. You have to let those new things that just happen in your way or something you encounter or suddenly working with a new person, if you're not open to those new experiences or new ways of working, which doesn't mean you have to deny what you've done or what you bring to it, but to not be stuck or fixed, which you also see happen, where it's just kind of the same thing over and over.
Well, and we'll get maybe circle back around to some of this as we go, but it does seem to me like I watched the documentary on the moving company's website, which was sort of a recent document of you guys,
It's during COVID. It's like the
right, exploring, reinventing something. But you have reinvented in the sense of from Jeune to moving company has been an evolution, which
yeah,
I'm interested to hear about. And now I think it's a big evolution for you to be uh, spending having this period of your career where you're also in New York and the current show.
chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the aging body.
What the aging body?
I mean, there just are things a person can't do anymore. I can't throw myself down on the floor over and over like I used to, or whatever. And then there's other
Whether
things that
whether or
are,
not you're go ahead.
and other things become available. You maybe start to find a more still center, or you have a deeper. You just have all these layers and layers of performances and of parts and of material and of language and spaces. And those add up to something as well, that only comes with years of doing it.
I was thinking in your years with Jeune Lune, were there so we were talking before about this my interest in sort of spiritual or transformational type stuff. And I know you said that there was that time at Gustavus Adolphus, there was a maybe, that Grotowski work, you had an experience of something that was entering into something really deep, or sort of exiting the everyday world into whatever the work you were doing. I assume that's happened many, 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 many times in the way you guys continue to work. Was there sometimes I've asked people like, are there any incidents of could be extraordinary synchronicities or um, altered states or things that were you could oftentimes people relate to them just as like peak experiences or peak moments, whatever those might be, and I'm wondering if
In specifically in terms of performance or in
yeah
creation.
yeah in the creative process or in
I mean, I
the
think the thing,
final performance or collaboration.
as a way to get it toward this, I think I have to say a little bit about Jeune Lune. I would never, and I don't think anyone would ever say we were particularly there was not a mysticism or that kind of uh, meditative. We were almost the opposite. Opposite. A little bit we were the profane to the sacred and the ridiculous to the sublime. Although I
Yeah.
think created moments in many of our shows that were sublime for sure, and did even have a sense of sacredness or mysticism maybe. But there's a we were the we were much more in line with the buffoons who
Mhm.
were out on the steps in front of the church criticizing and making fun, and uh, that's much more our our inspiration. But we weren't stuck in that. I mean, there are companies just like our purpose is to just do really vicious, funny, satirical, down and dirty, and we did some of that. We did a lot of that, but we also did, we did Mozart operas that are just, you get to some of these moments in these pieces, and they're so transcendent. It's you don't really know how it happens, like what that is. And we've done beautiful texts that were highly poetic and gigantic staging in huge spaces, that just take on, they're so beyond that kind of social in your face part of like commedia or buffoon based work. I think to our credit, we would pursue all of those things, and in some shows we'd put them all in the show, like right next to each other, to some degree. And I think that's what made our work so at its best, so theatrically exciting, and
Well,
also on point to whatever the material was, in maybe often a very surprising and allowed us to, especially with all the Molieres, to like really go at them in a way that most people would never go at a Moliere play. I think
I'm a
in terms
little,
of moments, I've certainly felt them in performance where it's just you get to a point, and there's often a point in rehearsal where you go, I don't know where that came from. I don't know how that showed up in the room, but now I understand. Or now, like, and you can sometimes it's collective where we're like, oh, that's incredible. Like what happened just there,
right.
and then it becomes a key thing in the show, and then the challenge is to repeat, because with theater you have to repeat and repeat and repeat. And so then there's other shows like the Miser we did 350 times at least. So there's a point where the show itself is like has that element of like a practice, like a daily discipline almost, it's a, and there is a point where certain things happen only because you've done it so many times. And when you thought there's nothing more to discover here or find, you suddenly do. And that's where it's like when I've had that happen so many times because we had so many different shows that we lived with extensively over numbers of years, sometimes with a huge break in between, and then we'd remount like Tartuffe. And so when you there's something that comes from that kind of work. We've had other shows that don't get that opportunity. They just, for whatever reason, they didn't work, or nobody wanted it, or and so you only get a few shots at it. But there's something that if we had been able to continue, it would have gotten to a place.
It's such a rare thing when
Yeah,
you get to do something 300 times. It's such an uncommon thing these days.
yeah. And the trick is for it to not become dead. That's where the real challenge is.
Yeah.
You know, that it's not fixed and becomes a fossilized thing, but that it's
I remember talking to Hal Lind, and who I mentioned before over at SCR, and I think he's played Scrooge there for I don't know what it is, 35 or almost 40 years now. It's unbelievable. But talking to him about what that was like for him over that long period of time. But so the Miser is the one you performed the longest. Is that right?
Well, it's one of the ones. We certainly did that a lot. We did Tartuffe a lot. We did Children of Paradise a lot. We did this crazy ass show called Yangs and Frogs, which was just a cabaret show that we created. That thing we did, God knows how many times. With my colleague Christopher Bays, he and I started at Jeune Lune at the same time. And now he's been on the faculty at Yale for 20 plus years.
I found a video of you doing that like Irma Vep with him. Was he the one that you did that with?
Doing which?
Irma Vep? Isn't
No, that's my friend Bradley.
Oh, Bradley.
I've also the show I'm going back on Monday to start rehearsals. He and I have done. We're in it and co-directing it, and we did a new libretto of this Puccini comic opera that we've completely reinvented and rewritten. And we've done a lot of writing together and performing. But Christopher Bays, one of my oldest colleagues, he lives right by me here in Brooklyn. We have another piece we've been working on he's been working on it off and on for 20 years. We keep getting close to getting it picked up. We're really close right now. I have to cut that part. I can't say it out loud. But we did a production of The Servant of Two Masters that originated at Yale, and then it went all over the country off and on for about 3 years. It eventually played at Tofana in New York. And that, I don't know, I bet we did that at 400 performances or something.
I've thought about like repetitions of various kinds, and a liturgy is a simple example. People go back and do a mass or something over and over, or certain texts that they would, in certain traditions, maybe chant for a lifetime. And there are pieces of work, I think, that pieces of material that you can return to. This is why people go back to Shakespeare over and over and over, because it's the kind of material that can keep revealing stuff to
I mean, that's the other one. I think I did Hamlet about 300 times.
Oh, wow.
Because we remounted it several times and we toured it, and that's like endless. That's just bottomless,
Bottomless. Yeah. So is it the kind of thing, like, do you have, to some degree, the material does the work for you in terms of keeping it fresh, because it continues to reveal itself to you? It's something larger than, at least that's what I experienced, something larger than myself that's, as rich just as life is, life continues to reveal itself. But are there things that you do to bring yourself to it fresh, or to continue to dig? Or is it just something that happens naturally as you go?
It's interesting because back in the day, at all those years at Jeune Lune, to a certain extent, we never had the time. We really didn't have the fortune of time to kind of live that way, because it's like we were also running a hardware store. I mean, as a metaphor, like we ran
practical.
All the decisions about everything. So you're always constantly planning. Then you have a meeting on the budget. Then you have the problem, with the bathrooms aren't working and the thing, and these props broke, and who's going to fix that, and whatever, and we got increasingly more larger and larger organization where we weren't doing everything. But in the early days, we literally were doing everything. But we were creating. I mean, the output was significant, and so as soon as one show was running, and we ran things a long time, so once the show was up and running, you were really going to live with it, and then you were in rehearsal for the next thing all afternoon, and probably meeting about and starting research on other projects that would happen next year. So you're constantly juggling all that. And what happens for me, what I loved about that is, we might be performing Hamlet at night, but during the day we would be rehearsing like a Feydeau farce, or like a new piece that we were just improvising that was very ridiculous or satiric, whatever, like completely different kinds of material. And so it's those things, you're living in those things right next to each other constantly. And there's something about that they influence each other. So even though there's maybe you're working on something that apparently has no relationship to Hamlet whatsoever, and Hamlet has, well, it relates to everything, but we weren't always doing Hamlet. So whatever show you might be doing, it had nothing to do with what you're working on, but they do end up influencing each other in surprising ways. And so that somewhat gets at what I think you're talking about. We never had a moment to reflect.
I think or worry about that.
And then I was raising 3 kids. So, in between I ran dinner and everybody piled on top of me. And then it was like, and now I got to go back and do Hamlet tonight.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that actually, quite frankly, once we started having our children around, and there were other children around the company, and they were all around a lot, especially on the weekends or sometimes in the green room during a performance and goof around in the dressing room, whatever. And that presence, and then around the house at home, that's the master class. Because children at various ages naturally do everything that an actor needs to know how to do. And it's at their disposal, but just on their fingertips in the most pure form.
Well, I think it's also that thing where whether it's in the rehearsals for some other project or just life at home, that's the thing. For me, you live a day and then you walk into the theater at night and you're full of whatever life you've been living. And
exactly. So I think we got really good. We had no choice in a way because of how we worked and lived. You had no choice but to be able to just shift gears. And when you started to put on the makeup and get in the costume, it's like everything, you had to be able to sort of, and it just would happen. And that's part of it out of sheer repetition. You just knew. And now it's there, and then you're back, and then the cue, whatever, and you're on, and you're there.
I guess the thing though for me is what I'm saying is that when I show up for the show that night, something happened with my dad or with a relationship, and that wasn't there yesterday, and it wasn't there the day before, and it's I'm walking or the rehearsal or the reading the play or the book or whatever it is that I'm working on during, like you say, during the day. So it's just living takes care of keeping it fresh every day.
Oh yeah, and there was a lot of living
available to it
around the company. There were screaming fights in the dressing room, and then it's like places,
right.
go do this, or there was like new news, like some incredible thing. We just got this grant, and that's going to solve all our problems. Or somebody just wants to take the show and bring it to wherever, and so there's all the highs and lows. But we always got together. We always warmed up. There was a whole routine of warming up before a show, just in terms of, being physically ready, vocally ready.
I always tell people, like, when you're talking about, sorry.
And we did that together. I mean, not led, everybody but we were all together, just on the stage, rolling and lying around and doing the things, and maybe going over a few things we were going to change and try tonight. Because that was the other thing. It wasn't like the show was ever like frozen and the director leaves. It's like the director was also in the show very often. So we would, go, last night this just continues to not work, so let's try it this way, So we were also continuing to constantly work on
it. A friend of mine toured with Peter Brook's company for a little while, and he said that Peter would, unlike kind of, let's say, regional theater directors who leave after opening night, he would constantly be there. And he said that he would purposely throw monkey wrenches, and you just come backstage and be like, this time, like, don't move from that spot for that entire scene. Like, I want you to just like not move your feet, just throw something at them, just for no other reason than just to keep them on their toes.
Absolutely.
and keep them creating in response to an obstacle of some kind, you know. And I mean that what you have is, but I haven't had that experience of being part of a company. It's absolutely, it's incredibly enviable.
I'm very grateful
In
for it.
many ways.
It's very rare now. I mean,
Yeah,
unfortunately, it's there's not a lot.
yeah, yeah. Going back what you were saying about the raising the kids and learning from them, and it's a
Yeah.
good segue maybe to talk a little bit about your current experience with your daughter, because obviously she was learning from you too. Otherwise, I mean, and here you are now. And she's been off in Paris now, what, for 10 years performing?
Yeah, she went when she was a junior in high school, came back for her senior year, and then has been there ever since. So really, since she was like 19, she's.
So tell me about this process and this experience for you. Like how has it been?
Well, let's see. Let me get as a way into that. You know that this is just a small. The other anecdote, or just the other little that
Yeah,
thing about how something shows up, because we were also writing constantly. We did so much creation, and even when we
sure.
did a Moliere, we were doing a new adaptation, and we had one guy in particular, David Ball, who we worked with a lot on
Mhm.
those, but we were very involved in it. Um, we anything like that we approached the Mozart operas. We completely just took everything apart and put it back together and rewrote, and it was very everything was always toward a very specific purpose. So um, each piece always felt like it was a new play. Like we never were like, okay, this play is this thing that has to be so we we always it was all raw material, but we were also always really trying to be true to the spirit of whatever the source was,
Mhm.
at the same time making it completely ours and completely reinventing it. And then we did a lot of other work that was required a lot of original writing, and some so then that whole process, or the rehearsal process, you would so often be locked, or you weren't. And then I would get on my bike and bike home for a dinner break, and while I'm biking, I would suddenly, the entire monologue that I was trying to write would just go and fall in place as I'm biking. And that's when I found that I swim as well. And it very so often it's like when you're that creative process where you're trying to find the thing, and you've got it's all spilled out on the table. It's kind of there, but it's not. And you go do something purely physical, biking, swimming, just a walk, whatever, sitting and staring at trees, or a hike, and all of a sudden it just, so I don't know what, that, which is not meditation, but it's a, it is a, it's doing something that takes your brain to a different place. And then that seems to open up the thing that you couldn't.
Yeah, I think people have a funny idea of meditation in mainstream culture. Like it's sort of the picture that most people have of it generally is, sitting still and immobilized. And I think there are many different kinds of meditations. There are moving meditations, and there are, in some ways, even the sitting still is not like about, I think when it's at best, it's not about disconnecting from the body or what's happening around us, but really maybe tuning into it, but using stillness as a method for that. But we use stillness as a tool all the time in theater too. And so the two, stillness and movement, are just two sides of a polarity. So, I think,
We would talk about that all the time at Jeune training, because people are like, "Oh yeah, well you guys do physical theater, so you just like run around, jump around, be physical." And we're like, "Well, no, it's it's not exactly what it is." And also, to be, you have to be able to find incredible stillness in order to be truly physical on stage.
yeah, I had a great movement teacher in college, a guy named James Donlin, and he early on said, stillness is like silence and music. You can't have the notes
Yeah.
don't make sense if there's no silence in between them. You have to have stillness, and it's actually the thing that's most important. It's underneath all of it. So
So
I think like there's also some traditions, meditation traditions or spiritual traditions, and I think Gurdjieff, who was the guy that Grotowski and Brooke were very into, and some others, are what would be called maybe non-dual. What they mean, like there's no separation, that the dualities are just intertwined, and there's a duality that is a wholeness, and so there's lots of body-based practices in those traditions, movement-based, even performance or art. In Zen, you have archery and tea ceremonies and flower arranging, and there's all these, you know, expressive arts that are not at all separate from whatever the insight path is, you know, that people are on, the transformative path. So I think I see theater as that way, or it potentially can be a non-dual path where there's no, you don't leave anything out. There's no need to isolate into a bubble somewhere in order to escape the world, as it were. It's not, I don't think that's, but I think in some ways it can be more powerful.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah.
You were going to say something else, I may have.
It was just the kid, like having children,
Yeah.
and that presence. I mean, the presence around the company became really fascinating, and certainly my home life. Just you just sort of just opens you. It just opens you to, ways of being, really, and it's also a revisitation of yourself.
Yeah,
You
recapitulation.
all your phases through being in those phases with your children. And but so for my daughter, I have a son and then two daughters, and the daughter that I'm was the one in France that we're doing this piece together, was the actor, is the middle one. And so she has these visceral memories. I mean, they all, grew up around the theater, and they were in a few shows as well. I mean, like we put her in a show when she was 10, in which we did this. We did a production of Maria de Buenos Aires, which is a Astor Piazzolla opera. It's a tango opera, and there were these two phenomenal sisters who we've worked with a lot. Who one's a mezzo, one's a soprano. They did all the Mozarts with us, and so they were playing Maria de Buenos Aires together as this sort of the shadow and the like the yin yang of that character a bit, or like the two sides of the character. And then we had my daughter Nora, be the child version of them, of Maria. And so she got to we had her do all kinds of crazy stuff, but we did a beautiful image where, because she's supposed to be born from the sea, the character, and we at one point pulled it, and there was this we had this gigantic fish tank on stage, this huge aquarium, and we had a way to trick it so that Nora could get in it from the back, and then it would be revealed in this, and suddenly she would just be floating inside this aquarium for a while. It was like when we came up with the idea for the image, and then started to work it out, because she could fit in there, and it was just such a. I mean, I don't know. From her perspective, that experience, I think, was wild to be inside, in this fish tank, staring and seeing the lights in the audience, the whole thing. And then we would pull her out, and then she would run and dance and do all this crazy shit on stage, and she'd go to like it was, and then she had some other beautiful moments in the show as well. But so that it wasn't like she wasn't doing, a kids show.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, it wasn't children's theater or something. Yeah. What an experience. Yeah, but that was hugely.
Because when we would drive to the show every night together, so the kids always grow up with like, and now we have dinner, and now Dad has to leave again, and get in the car and go back to the theater. And they used to do this thing where they would all grab my leg, and they'd be like, "Don't go, don't go."
Oh no, oh no.
And I would literally like drag all three of them hanging onto my leg to the door, and it was partly a joke, and it was also partly like, oh God. But when we did that show, then she got to go with
Come
me.
with you. Yeah.
I also had to leave for the theater after dinner, and then she came with in the car, and so then we would have these talks about theater in the car, and then she got to be in the dressing room with all the women who were in the show, and they would teach her and show her all kinds of things about makeup and perform, clothing and the costumes and stuff. And
Oh,
so we have that. She has that history with us, but now she's, she has a career in France and she's studied and worked over there. So she came to me a couple of years ago and said she wanted to do an adaptation of Orlando for herself as a one-person show. She had really fallen in love with the novel, but really fallen in love with Virginia Woolf and a lot of her writing and a lot of her philosophy and feminism and influence on feminism, plus her gorgeous language. And she was like, well, you've done a lot of adaptations of things. So I thought, I want to work on it with you. You help me do the adaptation so I can learn, because I haven't really done that. So that's how we began. And then partway through the process, and we did a whole adaptation that was sort of like what was of the novel for her, mixed with A Room of One's Own, and got to a point of a first good draft. And then she came and visited here and she said, yeah, it's pretty much what you'd expect. So, and I don't want to do that. So then we never, I was like, oh, okay. I only worked on that for like, a couple months, but
right.
uh, we were, anyway, but she came back a few months later and she was like,
Like it was just a bit too obvious or something. Like it was
I want to do I want it more complex, and I want
right.
to add other material in, and I want it to be more reckless or more,
Yeah.
So we started taking it apart, and then she came back and said, I've been thinking about it and looking at the material, because we started to look at the waves and some of the language from that, and said, I think we should do it together. So then I was like, sure. So then we started to rework the whole thing as a piece for the two of us, which really changed everything. And then it's gone through many stages of evolution. When we did the very first reading, a rough reading of the sort of a rough assemblage of some of the material with about 12 people here in New York, and most of whom knew us. And they were like, well, the elephant in the room is the two of you, because we hadn't put that element really into the piece, aside from the fact that we were doing it and working on it together. But we didn't reference ourselves at all. And so we were a little hesitant actually for a while, but then as we started to embrace that, it was clear that that's what was really behind all of it and informing all of it. So then it's gone through many phases until it's really starts from Orlando, and we get the novel in its essence, but eventually it moves into other material, and it eventually moves into ourselves increasingly. But they're all intertwined, and Shakespeare's intertwined, and Hamlet's intertwined, and then feminist philosophy is intertwined. I mean, it's a lot, but it seems to be working. We've done 4 performances.
Well, you said 4?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's it must feel like previews. Sorry.
Yeah. It feels like, we did a Wednesday, Thursday that really felt like previews, and Friday, Saturday we started to feel like this is where the show is trying to get to. And
so you got tonight and tomorrow, right? Also.
So, at the same time, we know, like, well, that's just, we're scratching the surface, but
yeah,
but that's, we got to start somewhere. So
that's exciting. This actually brings me to something I was thinking. I don't know how you feel about it in this way. I assume sounds like you're working in this way, bringing yourself to it, bringing a lot of yourself or yourselves to it. I think and maybe you always feel this way because of the company that you've worked in and the way that you've worked, you've been able to kind of continually create your own work in collaboration with a team. But I have this experience where there are moments where I'm in a creative process that are maybe a little different or special than others. Like there's some important, maybe this is always true, but there's some important piece in the process in me or for me, as in terms of my own transformations or my own becoming in some way. And it's in making the work, there's a big step that gets taken in who I am or who I am in the world, or maybe who I am in relationship to another person in this case, you know. So I'm wondering if you feel that in this case, that there's, it sounds to me like in many ways, maybe you've woven into it too, but it sounds in many ways the piece and the feminism of it maybe didn't come from your camp. It came more from, that was more her interest, you know, but,
Yeah,
um,
that
and the
very,
material.
and and she's been very clear from the beginning. She's like, this is, I'm in charge.
Right,
She's in charge. She's like, this is, I'm the director, you know.
right.
And so I get to weigh in, and I've always worked collaboratively. I've very rare, been very, very rare instances where I wasn't involved in the conception, creation of a piece, and I'm working with directors who I've worked with also as actors and collaborators and or maybe co-writers or I've always been in a very collaborative situation where ultimately I'm in the show, I'm acting, that's my primary purpose. But um, I've always been in a position to have a great deal of input on all aspects, and that's just not that I'm just used to that, really. Um, and I've been fortunate to be able to work that way. Um, so we're working very collaboratively, but really, she has the ultimate like veto power. She's been clear about that, and so she really did. She's been studying. She's part of a feminist collective in Paris. That's been a big influence on her in the last number of years, and so she's really brought that to the piece. And I think I've brought the process of creating a piece of theater and like what is the physical world of this piece and what are the images that we could get to and how to and and then she's brought other ones and a slightly different sensibility of how to create and rehearse that's more based on her experience in France. Um, but
So,
it's been very, we work really well together. Like we haven't had any
right.
big breakdowns or disagreements. We've
I,
built the show a deep discussion between the two of us, but it evolved over a lot of writing process. And then we went back and looked at my dinner with Andre.
sure, yeah,
So in Andre Gregory, I mean, in that movie, he's talking about working with Grotowski. He's talking
right.
about all this mystical,
So,
and Wally Shawn, but is Wally Shawn. And but they're also, when we went and looked closer, we found the script, the film script, and
oh,
Wally
wow,
Shawn's an incredible playwright, and it's totally scripted. And then in Andre Gregory's autobiography, he talks about when they made the movie and how it's one of the largest film texts that any actor's ever memorized.
right,
And they had to have it all memorized because of the way they shot it. It wasn't like, okay, we're doing this scene today, and so just get that one down and shoot it.
right,
And
right.
um, he says it's like Hamlet twice or something. I don't know. And maybe that's not totally true, um, but he talks in the autobiography about learning the text. But when you watch the movie, it's like it's written as if they're just having this conversation.
Yeah, yeah,
And Andre tells all these wild stories, and Wally's just kind of listening, and then he kind of responds a little bit. But it's incredibly written by Wally Shawn, and Andre writes about he couldn't find the character. He didn't know how to play Andre.
mm,
And then one day he's walking in New York, and I can't remember what the anecdote, the story was, but something clicked for him, and he was like, "Oh, now I know how to play Andre." And it was just that interesting thing of it's still a character, like it's even though it's completely themselves, it's also a fiction, and it's a and so we use that. I mean, it'll maybe make more sense to you when you see it, but we have this discussion where it becomes down to the two of us talking,
mm,
and we really use that as our inspiration. And so the discussion we did, it's very written, but we're working increasingly to try to do it where it's feeling like just a conversation. But I mean, literally every stutter, every okay, but I'm not even sure, maybe it's
right.
scripted, And
Yeah.
that process has been fascinating and really
I
rewarding.
always think I always think that's interesting. You have artists like Anna Devere Smith who works from like these
Yes.
texts that are like verbatim texts, or you go the other way. I have some friends in the San Francisco Bay Area who are drama therapists and use some, playback theater or reenactment type stuff as tools for dramatic for therapeutic work. Um, even hot in the therapy world is what they call narrative therapy, where they're teaching people to write their own stories, or even in the fiction world, we have creative nonfiction now, which are using creative writing tools to write memoir style writing. So I think all those boundaries are getting quite blurred in interesting ways these days.
I think that this show we've gone toward that in a way that we didn't originally think or intend. And that's been new for me. Like I mean, we've we've used moments in shows, but not in any autobiographical way.
Mm.
But the things that were happening were sometimes consciously and sometimes quite subconsciously infused into shows and into the writing of shows. Things that were happening between people, certain
Right.
slightly inexplicable, and it would be too complex to go into the examples. But so it's
Yeah.
not like I've never not brought myself into the room, but this is much the most I've ever done anything that referenced anything autobiographical.
Right. Yeah.
Never liked that. I don't really do that. Like
Right. And so,
I do theater to get away from myself.
right.
Um,
Right.
so yeah,
Yeah. And yeah, there's some schools that are very psychologically oriented, using substitution, and that's that sort of American method. And there's lots of people have different points of view on that sort of thing. But
and that was one thing. I mean, that was something we didn't like. Jeune Lune is not that. Like the
right,
pedagogy is, so much from the physical. Um, and then, but over time, we also language became so important to us. Text became so important, and in order to get in, character in text, then you have to, find how are you approaching that, and what are you drawing on, and what is that. But we never worked from that kind of American
internal place. Yeah, yeah. It's funny because everybody has their own aesthetic and their own path creatively. I've been very interested in especially recently, sort of wanting to work from a deeply personal place, like where there's things that are happening, I feel, inside me, psychologically or spiritually, that are, just beyond the realm of consciousness. Types of things that are very dreamlike. I like working with dream process or dream imagery, and I think rehearsal can just be a daydreaming type of experience. But when things are alive, like a good dream is alive and really rich and charged, but you're not quite sure what it is yet. And sometimes with a little excavation, it will reveal itself, but I really enjoy working in a way that allows something that's within me to sort of manifest through the creative process, it helps my becoming in some way. And
I feel like
um,
sometimes at some of our best, those sort of those moments of discovery in rehearsal or in the writing process that are just slightly they approach the mystical or the sorry, I just noticed I thought I was plugged in here, but I think somebody had pulled it.
it's all right. We're gonna get plugged in here.
Sorry.
It's all right.
We had a lot of family here and somebody unplugged that over the weekend.
I think timely metaphor. Go for it.
And I've experienced it so many times where it happens in rehearsal, and I've experienced it as a writer where it's that thing where you have a hunch, and Brooke talks about that. You start from a hunch. You just have a hunch that there's something in
Something
that
like that.
piece or in that language or just in that idea or thought, and trusting it. And then I think over time, what I've learned is that if you do trust that it'll show up, it does. And you never quite know from where or how. And it's the same thing as an actor in terms of finding how to play moments where, and sometimes it's going back to that thing. It's after you've done it 100 times where all of a sudden it shows up. And it's not, and sometimes it's purely, it's maybe from a interior
Mhm.
space, and other times I think it's a very, and I think they're so connected, it's a physical space, like our body can hold emotions and experience emotions. And so to me, like that idea of emotional recall, what I always find is it's in a show, you do one gesture or there's a move and every everything's there, like
Mhm.
it'll just floor you emotionally. And or one line, like a line will suddenly somehow, not because I put it there, but it will have taken on an emotional power. And every time
Mhm.
you get to that line, it's just
Charge.
there. But it's not a psychological relationship to the line. It's not even the subject of it. It's the shape of the words and how they feel in your mouth and what your body is experiencing when you produce that sound. And it's just cracks something open or it makes something available. And it also
You know,
works reverse in terms of comedy.
oh, really? And what do you mean by that?
It gets down to like it gets down to syllables in comedy.
Um,
It's like it's funny because the emphasis was on that syllable and there were enough syllables rhythmically to there, and it landed and it was slightly higher or lower and with a certain, and it's going to get a laugh. And the mathematics of that I find absolutely fascinating, which is music.
this is this kind of connects actually to what I was going to mention, which is I did an interview with Robert Parsons, who I don't know if I don't know if you know him, but he's a regional and American theater actor, and he worked with Robert Anton Wilson on, I think it was Black Rider at ACT, and he was describing that rehearsal process. And the Buddhists talk about something they call we have the physical body, and then they have what we call the subtle body, and then they have one or two other bodies as well. But the subtle body is basically like an energetic body, and it could be sort of an energetic field around a physical body, or it could be actually the energy of a whole space. Chekhov talked about this too, like atmospheres and different kinds of energies. But uh, with sometimes what I experience, and this came to me some through some Grotowski work that I did, which is that the energy is, it's just like the weather. It's bigger than me. It's sunny outside. I can just go out and participate in the sunshine, and it has a life much larger than my psychology. And it's like that with a play too. There's an energy around a creative work. There's an energy in a space that's larger than everybody participating in it. And I think it sort of like, if we can get on board and like serve that, um, then it starts to manifest. And some of it is that technical of like, oh, this is the spot and that's the tone or whatever. And so anyway, with my friend Robert, he said Robert would position people like to the nth degree. He'd be like, no, your fingers are too spread apart here. They need to be, you know, tighter together. And something would happen. He said when he would like click into exactly what Robert wanted, he said he just felt like this rush of energy that
Yeah.
I guess Robert was sensitive to, but that he didn't feel that until he surrendered to the direction. And once he clicked into it, it's like this, something gigantic would move. But which I think is a really, really beautiful way of perceiving what's going on. Yeah.
It
Um,
makes complete sense.
yeah, yeah. Uh, well, what is it? We're at about 12:30 now. So we've done a pretty good chunk of time here. I'm trying to think before we wrap up. I'm trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to wanted to touch on. I guess I'd like, maybe I could finish with this. Um, the world is constantly, I think one of the things I like about creativity as a spiritual path is that it's not stagnant. It's constantly evolving and creating and pushing into new territory that requires things like what you described, like faith. Really, what you were describing is having faith in whatever the miracle is of the creative process. Um, but I just think it's exciting that things are constantly changing and pushing forward, not just us, but the profession we're in. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see is exciting that's unfolding in the world of theater these days, or for actors, or in your own work, either way?
Well, there's a in the larger picture, you know, obviously the theater in particular, other performing arts and other arts maybe in general. But certainly the theater has COVID was, a particular challenge. And I think it has been a bit of a watershed moment in terms of the toll it's taking, just purely from like the
Ticket
shift,
sales.
finances, all those things that then impact everything because not as much is produced, so there's not as many opportunities for people to, get all of that has really, really shifted. And I think it's still actually way too early to know how it's all going to play out and what it'll lead to. I think on my most hopeful days, which are not as frequent as
Mhm.
hopeful days,
Honest. Yeah.
um, is that it, like any of those watershed moments, it will doors are going to open to new things that would just weren't around before, or new ways of working, or new ways of putting the work in the world, or you know combinations of people finding each other and working together, material that's approached and done. Um, but I think we're we're a ways out from really seeing what some of that potential is. Purely on a personal, just purely personal basis, it's been kind of utterly devastating for me. I mean, I just haven't, I've managed all the projects that just, fell like dominoes as we went into the quarantine and the shutdowns. A lot of them have finally happened. And in fact, in these last couple of months, a couple, I've had several things, one being the Orlando piece that had been worked on for 2 or 3 years just purely because of how COVID, you know, played out. And the one I'm going home to do, we've been working on since for 4 years, um, which would normally, none of these projects would have been worked on that long. They would have
Right.
gone to
Mm.
for production way sooner. So finally, for me personally, like some of these things are finally happening. So that's rewarding. I just don't quite know what the state of the theater is to receive them and help them thrive or go forward. I still don't quite know that. And then it coincides with what age you were or are when COVID hit, like where you were in your career. And that's what I've watched, like young actors who are just coming out of training programs, trying to launch a career, or who are just getting started. Like my daughter was like 5 years into really having a lot of work and really beginning to find her way after school, being out of the training, and then having everything just arrested. And I think if you're a young actor and then you suddenly don't get to be practicing for what adds up to a couple of years, like that takes a different kind of toll than somebody mid-career or somebody late, which is where I'm at. And for me, the experience was like I went in with a lineup of projects piled on, all of them that would have had a life or led to many things. That's just generally the way it works, that have not been able to happen. And so I mean, I up until really 2020, I rarely was not performing for most of my life since I was like 20. And now I just rarely have the opportunity to actually be in front of an audience. And that's my being in front of creating and then putting that work in front of an audience has been my whole life. And I don't have it in the same way. And I'm not sure that I ever will. But I'm also like, so then it's like, okay, well, I guess that's just forced. Like I'm retired now, and I don't really plan on being.
Yeah.
But it has been like, it is my life by necessity needs to change, and what the creative outlets are, and what shape and form they're going to take is it's a new era for me. And it's happened, when Lune crashed and burned and folded, which was in 2008. For the first time in my life, I was like, oh, now I'm a freelance actor.
Right.
I was out work, which most actors live that way, and I never did. I had a company. I was, you know, we worked constantly. But I managed to reinvent at that point, and a whole bunch of new, like all the work I've done with my friend Christopher Bays, and we brought these several shows that started at Yale, went all over the country, created a lot of work. All that became possible only because Jeune folded.
Right.
And now I try to trust that another new, a bunch of new things will hopefully be possible, a new phase, that I never saw.
I think when crises or extremely difficult times come along, right, nobody would choose them or wish them on anyone. And certainly, I think it's a little aggressive sometimes when people say, "Well, they happen for a reason," and that sort of thing. But I do think that we can make the best out of them, and I do think we can try to. And maybe sometimes in retrospect, we can look back and go, this is kind of an extreme example, but I think of I'm often I've been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for a number of years, and I think of the utter tragedy of what happened to that beautiful country and culture, and in the diaspora, in the Cultural Revolution. But I've often thought also about the fact that they were sort of there for whatever it was, 2,000 years, and developing their practices and their teachings and their way of life. And if that hadn't happened, like in the last 50, 60 years, the world has been blessed by the fact that all of those teachers have had to travel all over the world and make a new home. And again, I would never wish for that to happen for this result, but this is an extraordinary blessing to the world, I think, as a result. And maybe maybe in some weird karmic universe, like that's what needed to happen in order for this to happen. And so I don't know, maybe there's at the very least crisis and opportunity come hand in hand, and there's maybe we can make something out of it.
And I'm speaking also from a place of I've had a great life in the theater. I mean, there were lots of things that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And hopefully more things that will happen for sure. But, I've been incredibly fortunate, and it's a great privilege. So,
well, I, for one, am very excited that you're spending part of your time here in New York.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing the show tomorrow. And I hope, I have a feeling you will be doing more shows in New York, and I look forward to seeing more work.
Thank you. I hope so too. I'm really excited for you to see it, and it'll be great talking to you afterwards.
Yeah, I look forward to that. All right, hey, thanks. I hope you go out and enjoy this gorgeous day we're having. Absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, and thank you for stopping me on the street.
Of course, man. Yeah, that was
Don't I know you?
yeah. I'm really glad we got to do this, and I look forward to be continued.
Great. Thanks, James.
All right, Stephen. Have a good one.